Hi, Sean here, and I am the co-host of Green Screen, the environmental movie podcast. And this is a video that we promised in our new episode, episode 8, on the French Connection, that we would do in connection with that episode. And this is a video on the places of the French Connection. So the episode comes out today, and I've not been good at putting our episodes on the YouTube channel. I should be better at doing that, but you can definitely listen on Apple and the various podcatchers of your choice. This is our 8th episode, and as you know, on the Green Screen Show, my co-host and I, Cody Clymer, deal with the environmental aspects of movies, popular movies. So we've done a couple. We did Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We did How Green Was My Valley. We did Mad Max Fury Road recently. Our previous episode just before this one was The Empire Strikes Back. And now today we're doing The French Connection, the Best Picture Oscar winner from 1971, really classic film, cops versus drug smugglers, and it's really a great movie. So that's going to be a great episode. But I decided that I was going to do this extra video because there's a lot of really interesting geographical locations associated with the French Connection. And as I mentioned in the episode, a lot of the places that you see in the film have not changed very much in real life since 1970 when the movie was filmed. So I thought it would be interesting to visit some of those places on Google Maps. This is incidentally how I teach history. I'm teaching a class right now on the Vietnam War. I'm going to be teaching one soon on the 50 most important things in history. And the way that I do these classes is to go to the places on Google Earth, Google Maps, where these historical events actually happened. So it's a geographical focus, also historical focus, and I think it's a fun way to learn history. So I've collected 11 sites that are filming locations and places associated with the film, The French Connection, and we're going to see them in order. So let's just take a quick tour. We're going to start in France. Of course, I'm assuming you know a little bit about the movie. The action begins very briefly in France and then quickly shifts to Brooklyn, New York City, dealing with the two characters, Popeye and Cloudy, played by Gene Hackman and Roy Scheider, who are on the trail of drug dealers, drug smugglers from Marseille, who are bringing heroin into the United States. So it's sort of a cat and mouse type of thriller with a lot of interesting locations that you see on screen. And there were no sets on the movie. It was all done on location, and a lot of these places still exist. So let's get into it. Okay. So it really does help if you have seen the movie and listened to our episode. We are going to start in France and in Marseille, actually. The first place we're going to visit is in one of the very first scenes of the movie, where the French undercover policeman is shot by one of the drug ring's assassins. And it happened and was filmed on this little street here in the back of Marseille. So this is a Google Street View of that exact street where this was filmed, the Rue des Moulins. I cannot pronounce French, so I'm sorry about that. But if you've seen the film, this should look really familiar to you. And this is the same as it was in the 70s, even with the graffiti and the vaguely kind of menacing look to this place. There's some distortions on the street view here, but you can see how narrow these streets can be. And this is really old world Europe. So I don't know exactly which doorway it is, but at the beginning of the film, you see the French undercover police officer goes into a doorway, is followed by the assassin and shot point blank. And this is, of course, the guy takes his baguette. We have some interesting graffiti on the wall here, but these back streets of European cities have not changed in many decades, so they really do still look like this. There was a second unit photography crew that went to France to film, and I think it was probably just a bare bones type of unit with the director William Friedkin and maybe just a couple of other crew members. It's really not was not a big production, was very cheap, and had that very kind of claustrophobic sort of documentary feel to it. So this is the type. I think these stairs are shown in the film. This may be the doorway where that scene took place, but it's the opening seconds of the movie, really, and so it's kind of a thrill to see these places on Google Maps. So this is Marseille, and Marseille was in real life the hub for so much of the drug trade to the United States in the middle part of the 20th century. Was ultimately disrupted by U.S. and particularly French police in the early 70s, about the time the film was made. So this was really changing at the time. Okay, let's go to our second location. And we're still going to be in France here, in Marseille. There's a scene, again, in the opening minutes of the film that we see a cafe, an outdoor cafe in France. You see it's only a few blocks away. We haven't gone that far. But this is basically the quays. Marseille is a huge port city, which is the reason why it became a hub of drug trade. And there's a restaurant that you see here in the beginning of the film that is still there, and I'll show it to you on the street view. Okay, so it should resolve here. And yeah, this is one of the main drags in Marseille. And you see this block, and particularly this restaurant. I believe it's a kind of a long shot where they come in on it. But one of the characters is eating outside. So, but you see this again looks exactly like it did in the movie, and really hasn't changed very much. Marseille has, for centuries, been the gateway from Southern Europe to the Middle East, the Levant, and Mediterranean area. So it was a natural place, and it's also a hub of France's trade, North Atlantic trade with the United States and other parts of Europe. So it's pretty much inevitable that it would have become a drug trafficking center. But Marseille is very old. This area's been like this for centuries. Many of these buildings date from the French Empire style, and it's technically, I guess it is on the French Riviera, although it's not the posh Riviera type of place that we think of when we think of Monaco and places like that. But this is pretty much the same part of the world. So lots and lots of ships tie up here. This is a huge maritime trade. And the French Connection, I'm talking about the drug ring. We talk about this in the episode, that they tended to use French sailors as drug mules to bring various quantities of heroin into the United States aboard French cargo ships that docked in New York City. Interestingly enough, as we talk about in the episode, not much of most of the heroin that was transported into the United States stayed in the New York area, at least in this early period, 30s through 60s, basically. So the French Connection really was a real life drug ring. It was interceded, or there was a large intercession of heroin made in the early 60s. That was the basis of the book, The French Connection, by Robin Moore. And interestingly enough, the screenwriter, Ernest Tidyman, never read the book that he wrote the screenplay on and won an Oscar for. So that's kind of an unusual state of affairs, but that did happen in this case. Okay, let's go to our next location, still in France, still in the Marseille area. Again, early in the film, there's a scene where the chief villain, Charnier, played by Fernando Rey, is talking to the assassin, and then also the person who's going to be bringing the drugs over, the TV star, who appears later in the film. And this occurs, actually, there's a number of these fortress islands in the harbor of Marseille. These are all ferry lines that you see here going to various parts of the Mediterranean, but there's a scene that was filmed at this famous castle, and I cannot pronounce it, but you see its name there. And this is a medieval fortress, medieval era or early modern fortress that has been built up over the centuries, is still there. There's a scene that takes place on the front or on the top deck of this castle. And there's a photosphere where we can see exactly what it looks like. So you can recall this from the movie where they're walking around up here and talking about the drug deal, and the TV star needs the money, and he's decides to accede to the drug dealer's wishes and it turns out, slight spoiler, that he's agreeing to transport the heroin in his car, which will be transported by ship across the Atlantic to New York City. So this fortress, the Chateau d'If, I'm sure I mispronounced that, but this actual fortress appears in the Alexandre Dumas book, The Count of Monte Cristo. It's a very famous location in Marseille and commands a view of the harbor and the town, as you can see. Really kind of magnificent medieval architecture here. So great view, really interesting, and it looks exactly like it did in the film. So this location has certainly been preserved perfectly. So we'll look around here. Some of these great photospheres on Google Maps, you can really see a tremendous amount of scenery. These are all uploaded onto Google Maps through a service called Picasa or Panoramio. I believe this is a Picasa, but they are tagged with geocoordinates, and that's how Google Maps knows where to show them. I use these so much in my teaching, and it's just such an incredible resource because you can really see the places of history and see what they look like as if you're visiting them on the ground. So that has attained a new importance for us in this era where we're now, most of us, sequestered at home due to the COVID-19 epidemic. Okay, so we're going to shift to New York City, just as the film does. Got a couple of locations there. Okay, so this is, let me get my notes here. Oh, this is the site of Sal and Angie's candy store. Let me zoom out, show you where we are. So we're basically in central Brooklyn here. There's Manhattan, but this is the kind of the heart of Brooklyn here. So Sal and Angie's candy store, which is now, I believe, a Mexican restaurant, if I have that correctly, but we'll see it here on the photosphere. Okay, so the building, as you can see, still exists. This is exactly just right out of the movie, although the storefront has changed, but it's probably still the same storefront, or the same place. These long, very narrow shops that go back onto the back of the block. As you can see, Mesa Azteca restaurant and bar, but this is where the candy store is in the film, where Sal, played by Tony LaBianco, and his girlfriend are processing and moving heroin. So this location has not changed, except for the storefronts, has not changed at all since the early 70s. Maybe this building may be newer. I don't even know if it is. It might have been there at the time, but we'll spin around and I'll show you here. That grocery store is of newer construction. But look at this building here. This is the same factory building where the cop characters, Popeye and Cloudy, stand on a top floor and, okay, I'm going to do that again. This is the same building where the Popeye and Cloudy characters are staking out. They are staking out from one of these upstairs windows and looking at the candy store across the street. This was an old factory at one point. We speculate in the episode it might have been a hardware manufacturing facility, tool and die, something like that. Part of our analysis on green screen, we talk about the process of deindustrialization, which is how the United States lost most of its manufacturing base in the early 70s as Asian and European countries brought their industrial plants online and competed effectively with American manufacturing. Huge process and a complicated one that explains why the inner cities became the way they did in the 60s and 70s. So that's the candy store, and then this is the stakeout location here. We'll just go up the street, and you can see, again, does not look very different than it does in the film. Cars are new, but most of the buildings are pretty much the same as they were. Wyckoff Avenue and Sudham Street here in Brooklyn. So I'm not that familiar with the geography of Brooklyn. Maybe some of you are, but this is definitely one of the most interesting movie locations from the film The French Connection. Okay. A lot of the businesses and such you see in the film have been replaced. Of course, this was filmed 50 years ago, so naturally things are going to change. But many of the buildings and fronts and that kind of thing are still the same. And we're now in Manhattan. Let's see where we are. Okay, yeah, so we're in Lower Manhattan. I guess this is, I'm not sure. Okay, this is the Bowery. I'm not sure where Hell's Kitchen begins or ends, but this is that area of the Lower East Side. And we're going to go to the location. There's a scene early in the film where the cops are staking out Sal, the small-time hood, and he attracts attention because he's running up a big bill at a restaurant called Ratner's. And it's now just a Dunkin' Donuts, or excuse me, Dunkin'. They've changed it, but this was the location that they were looking at. The restaurant was here in the early 70s. It's changed since then, but look at these old buildings. This building was undoubtedly there in the early 70s. And these kind of narrow or these very urbanized streets in Brooklyn pretty much has not changed. So Delancey Street, this is a staple of this part of the city. They're building something there. This is taken in October, so who knows if construction is still going on. I know a lot of things have been affected by the epidemic, but anyway, there's always something being built up or torn down in New York City, but this is where Ratner's was. This tower, I don't recall whether we see it in the film or whether it is period from the period, but maybe. Actually, the architecture looks much more modern, so you never know. But yeah, this is where Ratner's was located. And this building certainly was here in the 70s. So another of the great French Connection locations. Okay, I'm going to go to another scene from the film. I comment in the episode that a couple of times we see the home of Popeye Doyle, the Gene Hackman character, and we comment that it looks like the projects. And in fact, it is. This is a housing project in Brooklyn, Avenue X, and it is called, what is the name of this? I forget what the name of this is, but this is the actual location where Popeye's, one of these buildings, I don't know which one it is, but one of these is his apartment building, and this is the place where the French assassin takes a shot at him, or several shots at him from a rifle. This is where he's screaming, "Get down, there's a sniper up there." That's where this was filmed. It has changed somewhat since the 70s. As you'll see, it's not quite as depressing and brutal as it looked at the time when the projects were built. I'm not sure when they were built. My guess would be early 60s, but you can see these are the exact same buildings. We'll zoom in here. And these, they've been a little bit augmented with, playgrounds, and the trees are much older than they were in the early 70s, but they're still, projects. So this is a type of urban scape that started to come about with large scale, what they call urban renewal in the 50s and particularly the 60s. And there was a housing crisis. There was a terrible housing crisis all over America's big cities, particularly in the late 50s and early 1960s. And many of these projects were built to try to alleviate the housing crisis. And they're basically concrete blocks with prefab apartments. We see the inside of one of these in the film. And I remark in the episode, it looks like a prison. It's really not a very pleasant place to live, although it seems to be a little bit more so than it was in the early 70s. But still, you can't quite get over the brutalist architecture. But yeah, this is the building complex where the Popeye character lives. And so I thought that was very interesting that my speculation turned out to be correct, that it was, in fact, a project. Okay. Next. Kind of zooming through these here. There's a couple of hotels that appear in the French Connection, and many of them have since been turned into apartments and condos, particularly as this one has. So you'll see where we are. We're on the edge of Central Park, basically Central Park West, Central Park East. Is there a Central Park East? I don't know if that's a thing, but anyway, we're on the east side of Central Park, and this is the location of the Villain Charnaire's hotel, where Popeye Doyle stakes him out, and then later he calls one of the other law enforcement crew and says, "I'm sitting on Frog One." This is where he picks him up at the hotel. So you'll see the hotel, which is now an apartment building, same awning, probably built in the early 20th century, but this is now private apartments, was a hotel in the early 70s. So we're on East 69th Street, and move back here. So the park, I'm not sure which way the park is, but it's definitely close. So this area has become, it wasn't that bad in the early 70s, but has definitely become more gentrified. Really, anything around Central Park, property values have gone up tremendously in the past couple of decades. And now most of this area has been priced out by ordinary people. So you're going to have a lot of money to live in this location. So you see these classic brownstones and that sort of thing. And this former hotel, now exclusive apartments and condos. But this is where the he's French in the movie, played by Fernando Rey, a Spaniard actually in real life, but this is the hotel where Popeye finds him. So again, location pretty much, the use has changed, but the building and such is the same as it was. Okay. So there's a foot chase. There's really two chases in the French Connection that are noteworthy. One is a chase on foot, and then of course the famous car chase. But let's deal with the foot chase first. This is where Doyle comes across Charnay and chases him in various parts of the city throughout the very, very cold winter. So we're going to go to Grand Central, and then there's the whole thing with the train where he gets on the train and gets off, and the doors are closing and all that kind of thing. So this is where it is. But I just want to show you where this is. This is formerly the Pan Am building. You see it in a lot of movies from the era. It was one of the largest buildings in the world on Park Avenue, now called the MetLife building. It ceased to be the Pan Am building in the 1990s when Pan Am went out of business. Many people did not think that was possible, but of course that did happen due to changing times, changing economics. So we'll go down to the platform on the subway platform where the scene takes place. And you see a lot of, I call these Google ghosts. These are people who move because the way these panoramas are taken, you take them in like a sequence. and then people move in between, and the pictures are stitched together. So people move while the sequence is being taken. You'll only get part of them on the finished product, but this photosphere was taken down on the Grand Central platform. This is exactly the platform where the kind of cat and mouse game takes place in the film. This is well, obviously it's been here for a long time, but this was kind of interesting because you can see in this scene that Charnay, the Fernando Rey character, is holding a newspaper, a copy of the New York Times, with a fairly easily recognizable photo on, and it's shown in the movie, easily recognizable photo on the front page. I went into I was looking up the New York Times at my university library. This was a couple of years ago for some other reason, and just happened to, I knew that the film, The French Connection, was made in early 1970. So we're talking about like January 1970, and you can see in most of the scenes how cold it is. So I just ran the microfilm and actually found that front page. And the scene that takes place here was filmed on January 9th, 1971. There's a Google ghost there. I don't know whether it's that guy's foot, but it's somebody's foot. Anyway, so this is the platform. There's a number of photospheres on this spot, but most of them are of the Grand Central Terminal, which is up above this one. So you can see that it's real easy to find on Google Maps if you're interested in looking at that. Okay. So now we turn to the second chase. This is the famous car chase. Some people say the best car chase ever put on film, and I won't dispute that that judgment. So we'll go there. The chase was filmed on a number of blocks up and down Brooklyn. So this is one of the places where the chase occurs on Stillwell Avenue. And of course, it's Doyle is chasing an elevated train on which the French assassin has fled. So as we talk about in our episode, we're going to the Bay 50th Street station is where we are. I'll show you the photosphere of it, and it'll look very, very familiar. But the impetus behind this chase, as we talk about in the episode, was a desire to outdo Friedkin, the director of the film, his desire to outdo the famous car chase through San Francisco depicted in Bullitt, 1968 film with Steve McQueen. So this is the French Connection chase location, and you see this has not changed a bit. So you can almost imagine Doyle's car kind of barreling down this road and trying to weave amongst the traffic and the pylons here, and very, very dangerous situation. This chase was filmed without permits. It was filmed at a much lower speed than it appears in the movie. As we talk about in the episode, they played some tricks with the speed of the film, make it look like it was going much faster than it really was. But this was still horrendously dangerous to film. And you can recall in the film that Doyle is driving down this street and keeps looking up at the train, and he's looking up at the tracks going above here. So there's a long stretch. The chase went on for, gosh, I read it like something like 50 blocks or something like that. But Stillwell Avenue, New Utrecht Avenue is also in this area. And that was also a scene of the chase. So again, this looks exactly like it did at the time. So the famous car chase from The French Connection. Okay. There was a location that I really wanted to find because I had seen it on one of the documentaries that was on the 2008 DVD version of The French Connection. There was a documentary called the Poughkeepsie Shuffle where they visited a lot of these locations. Of course, that was 2008, and now things have changed. But one of the locations they visit there's a short scene in the middle of the film, toward the middle of the film, where Popeye comes out of a bar, and it looks like it's a very early morning, and the suggestion is that he spent the night there, and he looks very disheveled. I think the bar is like Sammy's, or I don't know what it's called, or something like that. But I really wanted to find the bar because in the 2008 DVD documentary, it looked exactly the same as it did Unfortunately, it has been torn down in the 12 years since that was made, but I'll show you this was the location of it. So you see the bridge and that sort of thing, which you see in the background of that scene. Again, we've got the L tracks going on here, but this corner in this area has in fact changed. But still, it's kind of this gritty urban environment. We talk a lot about urban environments in the episode of Green Screen. We talk about why they became the way they were and how housing policy and federal mortgage policy affected all of this stuff, and how and why the cities became the way they were as depicted in the film. But this is the kind of street corner that you see often in The French Connection. Bridges and infrastructure play an interesting role in the movie. In one point, you can see the World Trade Center towers under construction in the background, not in this scene, but in others. These are brand new towers here. But there's definitely a lot to see here. New York City's infrastructure is fabulously complex, tangle of bridges and highways and viaducts and that sort of thing, much of which was built up over particularly the 20th century. And we mentioned Robert Moses in the episode. He was an urban planner active in New York from really the 1930s onward, even before the 1930s and into the 1960s. So a lot of what you see in New York is a result of Moses planning there. I think, is that oh no, that's the Woolworth building, I think, not Empire State. But you can see the financial district down in that area. Okay. Last location. We're going to go to Ward's Island, and you're going to see in The French Connection, they visit this location and nearby locations various times. But this is the site of the big shootout at the end. The factory that they're running through is, I believe, no longer there, a part of the old water treatment plant. This is part of infrastructure here. So there's a water treatment plant in this part. That, in fact, that's what these are. These are drain ponds of some kind for the treatment facility. So a lot of New York City's water gets treated here, but there's a photosphere that should resemble what the landscape looks like when all the cops are converging on the crooks, and then they kind of fan out through the area. But this Ward's Island, this is what it looks like. So again, you see these old, power plants and water towers and things like that, and those are seen in the film. This bridge is definitely seen in the film at some point. So this is pretty much the same thing as it looks like. It's been greened a little bit. There has been some renewal here. This was, of course, as you remember in the film, just a junk heap. In later decades, since the 70s, there's been some attention paid to green spaces and rehabilitating decayed urban spaces, and that's the result of that you see here. So things are getting greener in New York little by little. Some people say that the 60s and 70s was kind of the low point of New York's physical environment, and you can definitely make a case for that. So, but still, a surprising amount of this infrastructure is still there and exactly the way that it was in the early 70s. So this is, and you can see this is called Hellgate Circle. Hellgate is a very old name, but I believe derives from the Dutch when this was New Amsterdam back in the 17th century. So this area has a very long history. This building that you see in the background here is probably seen in the film. There's a lot of these types of buildings that you see in the backgrounds and such, and they have not changed in many decades. So that is where we're going to leave it. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed this little tour of a couple of places you see in The French Connection. Please do listen to our episode of Green Screen. It's a fun podcast. We really have a lot of fun doing it, and just getting into the history and the geography and the environmental issues and things like that. very, very fascinating. So please do listen to Green Screen. If you have not already, you can find it on iTunes or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher of choice. And please do leave a review. It'd be great. It helps us find new listeners, helps other listeners find us. So very helpful if you can give us a good review. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the episode. And we will be back in 2 weeks' time. I think our next film is Tremors. I don't know if I'm going to do a video on that, but you can definitely listen when we get that up. So thanks very much, and we'll see you later.